Again guys, welcome back to the House of Devlin. I'm Big Al Devlin, and this is another video as part of my Realm series that I have as part of my Nordic Paganistic series on here on the House of Devlin. Now, the Realm series is a series where I, in every single video, talk to you as much as possible about one of the realms found within the Viking cosmos. I give you as much information on it as I possibly can, and maybe hopefully give you some facts that you didn't know, and certainly make the places more understandable, certainly if not in the way that they appeared, at least in the nature of the beings that resided there. Now, we've already described Midgard, and of course that's the world that we live on, so we're very familiar with the material or the mortal realms, essentially. I've also described in my previous video Asgard, which would be described essentially as the heavens, directly above us on the cosmological tree of Yggdrasil. It could interact sometimes with our skies, and of course it was the realm where the Aesir tribe originally came from, and a large number of the Vanir also resided, and it literally had a direct sort of connection between itself and Midgard through the Bifrost. However, today I'm going to be describing a very different realm, a realm of the gods, but a very different realm, arguably part of the heavens, but arguably very much not part of the heavens at the same time, and that is Vanaheim. Now, Vanaheim is, wow, how can I describe it? It is the home of the gods and goddesses of fertility. That's how it's described in old tongue, essentially, in the old passages. More accurately, today we would probably describe it as the home of the gods and goddesses of nature. And there's an important distinction, because the way that you would use fertility back in the old days is essentially the way that we would use nature today. So it brings it up to date, and it allows us to understand certain concepts a little bit more easier, it allows us to visualize things a little bit easier. Now, as you can imagine, a world which is the home of an entire tribe of gods and goddesses that are all related to nature, is going to be a very verdant, very green world, full of trees and life and everything along these lines. And so in contrast to Asgard, for example, which was a fortress full of gold and steel and gems, full of halls of warriors where, there were very accurate, very specific descriptions, for example, of the Hall of Valhalla in this case, of how many windows, how many doors there were, so on and so forth. There was very accurate descriptions to the point where you could almost draw a map of Asgard. But Vanaheim was a realm that men did not have much of a clue on how it looked. It was very rare for men to go to Vanaheim. They normally went to Asgard. A few men, for example, were taken by Freya and may have, as a result, gone. Freya resided within Asgard, but may have taken her men that she took from the field of battle back to Vanaheim for whatever reasons, for a period of time. And so it's at this point where you might find yourself as a mortal man dead at this point, but nonetheless a mortal man actually visiting a realm that no other men or women would have ever seen before. And this realm, as you can tell from its name, if you understand the sort of the suffixes and prefixes of language, you'll understand that when something ends in Viking cosmology, in guard, for example, it means it's of the Innengard, or of the ordered, of the of the structured, of the civilized world. Okay, so Midgard, which was made in the image of Asgard, is a very ordered place in many respects, or at least strives to be an ordered place. The men that live on Midgard try to make order out of chaos and try to reflect themselves, or be a reflection themselves of Asgard, which is of course the sort of paragon of virtue in regards being ordered and civilized and very structural in its approach, and very civilized and in every aspect really. Whereas Vanaheim was a realm that existed in the heavens because it existed on the branches of Yggdrasil, so it was above Midgard. So you could argue it was part of the heavens, but it was never seen, I would say, as one of the heavens, or as the heavens as Asgard was, because it was actually a part, or described or defined more accurately, as part of the Uttengard, which is of course the disordered, the chaotic, the anarchistic, the wild aspects of life. It was actually of the same nature as Jotunheim, the land of the giants. And so you may find it hard to believe, but Vanaheim, which possessed the Vanir tribe of gods, that this was their home. This is where they came from. The Vanir tribe of gods came from Vanaheim and had an alliance with the Asgards, and it had that alliance with them and created a pantheon of gods which the ancient Nordic people prayed to and worshipped and dedicated themselves to and made sacrifices to. But the gods that originated within that pantheon, originated from Vanaheim, were ultimately of the Uttengard and not of the Innengard. It's an interesting concept and point to make in this case, because it has significant impact on our understanding of what Uttengard could mean, but also on the nature of the gods that of course come from a homeworld of not chaos, but simply just a wild nature. Vanaheim was a place where life was wild, and the gods themselves and the world of Vanaheim itself was seen as being more wild and less civilized as a result than not only Asgard but also Midgard itself. The gods of Vanaheim, the Vanir, were seen as being, I don't think the word less civilized is correct to use it, but I think more wild, I think is more capricious, is an accurate description of they were more wild and more capricious, and as I say, less civilized potentially than men themselves. And just before I continue with the video, that's why I have Freya represented on my arm here in such a manner. She looks quite brutally sort of represented on my arm, with lots of aspects of nature around her, with carvings into a skin, blood marks on her. Of course, she was a practitioner of Seder magic, and I wanted to represent her primal nature, or more primal than simply the Asgard nature, with a tattoo like that, in comparison to a structured tattoo like that, Mjolnir, which represents, of course, Thor. Now, what impact did this have? Well, first of all, it does explain potentially why there was a war between the Asgard and the Vanir tribes early on in the cosmos. Not a lot of people knew, but the Vanir and the Asgard were at war for a very long period of time, and there were casualties. And during the war, it became, towards the end of the war, obvious that the Vanir tribe of gods were equal in power to that of the Asgardians. Even though the Asgardian gods were, gods of virtue, gods of justice and order, but also more importantly, gods of war and gods of destruction in their own way. They were very warlike in nature. They could not overpower these gods of nature, these gods of fertility, which shows you just how powerful nature was seen by the ancient Nords. The power of nature is equal in power to the power of the gods to themselves. And the Asgardians and the Vanir, as I say, after a very long time, they didn't quickly come to this conclusion. It took them centuries, if not millennia, of fighting between themselves to come up with the conclusion that, we're never going to beat one another. We're never going to defeat one another. There's only one of two ways this is going to end up. We either wipe each other out, or we batter ourselves into submission for the rest of eternity. We are gods, we are hard to kill, and so that is a possibility. We just fight for the rest of eternity until Ragnarok comes. And so the Vanir and the Asgardians, in the end, just got sick of fighting one another, and so formed the Aesir-Vanir alliance, which is the pantheon of gods that ancient Nords became to worship in equal measure, just because a god was of the Aesir tribe, for example, originally, and as a result, and as a guardian in its complete sense, doesn't mean that he was more worthy to worship than a god that came from Vanaheim. They were seen as equals, very much so, amongst themselves and amongst men also. However, as I say, there was a different nature between the two gods, and it allows you to understand why they would go to war with one another at the very beginning anyway. Because it's always something I wondered, why would they go to war with one another when really they were both two sets of good gods, essentially. They were more creative in nature, and the Van and the Vanir were nothing like the giants in many respects. They respected life. It didn't seem it didn't seem to make sense to me as to why the Asgardians and the Vanir would go to war with one another. But when you learn, obviously, through further, teaching, self-teaching and stuff like this, reading deeper into the texts, it's easy to see actually that the Vanir, who lived in Valheim, were actually closer to the giants in nature than they were the Asgardians, and so it's easy to see how the war started. However, unlike the giants, they were capable of seeing the path of Innengard. They understood that even though they themselves were of the Uttengard, and I'll describe that in a minute, but essentially of the chaotic, of the wild, of the potentially destructive, even though they were naturally part of that they understood that this must exist, but if controlled, there would be no issues, there would be no problems. It could be a benefit and a positive both to themselves, to the Asgardians, and to the men of Midgard, and to the cosmos as a whole. And so they learned to control their Uttengard aspects in a much greater fashion. However, of course, bear in mind, nature is nature is how can I describe it? Nature is both cruel and giving at the same time. It gives you life, it gives you nourishment, it gives you food, and it gives you, 1,000 years ago, if you were to put yourself in the eyes of a Viking farmer, there was no such thing as Viking farmers, but a Nordic farmer, you would understand that your harvest, for example, would come potentially at the will of the gods, of the inner, at the will of nature, and it could come for decades with no problem, but all of a sudden, bang, there could be a drought or a famine, and you and your local community could find yourself starving to death. You and your local community could find yourself dying out first. And so nature is both giving and cruel, and this really represents itself very well, as I say, within the gods of the Vanaheim. Very well indeed, in my personal opinion. They are a great representation of it. And the world of Vanaheim really represented their Uttengard nature, their chaotic, or should I say, more wild and capricious nature than in comparison to the Asgardians. It was not. If you ever hear of a description of Asgard, it is a fortress with many halls, often made of silver, gold, and gemstones, were found all over the place. There's accurate descriptions of how many doors and windows each hall had, especially Valhalla. There was a very descriptive detail from several of the Eddas of how many, entrances there were, how many fireplaces there were, so on and so forth. The Viking people took a pride in being able to describe in detail what Asgard was like. Yet, if you look at the old texts and any reference to Vanaheim, there's very little to say about it, and I think it's simply because Vanaheim was chaotic and wild in nature. It was willing to change. It was capable to change, just because that's what nature does. That nature is full of change, and it would have been a world full of trees and meadows and streams and brooks and so on and so forth. But it was more chaotic in nature than, for example, Asgard and even Midgard, the world of men itself. And a Vanir, that is a goddess, god or goddess of the Vanaheim and their world itself, would have been seen as being less civilized and more wild. So more wild is equal to less civilized. It's the same thing. Then not only the Asgardians, but also of Midgard and man and woman themselves. We were seen as being more ordered than them. Now, that doesn't mean that we are their superiors. They were gods and we are mortal men. But it just shows you how some of the Uttengard gods were willing to play, in the great scope of things, a creative role. They weren't all destructive like the giants often were. The Vanaheim were of the Uttengard, yet they played a major role in the governorship and the rulership of Asgard, and Asgard as a whole had a creative influence on all of the 9 realms. I don't believe there's really anything really more to say there. I've obviously, made parallels between the Vanaheim and nature, its relationship with both Asgard and Midgard as a whole, in the sense that it was seen as a sort of more wild land than Asgard and Midgard, and it's both the inhabitants of both. But it was still a land of gods who had decided, you know what, we are going to make a good change on this world, and it's for me it's the most interesting of all the realms, because it shows you not only an individual, but a whole pantheon of gods, goddesses, and an entire realm that is Uttengard in nature, but an Uttengard in nature that has been controlled and kept in check. An entire realm kept in check, so that the smaller, that the Uttengard nature of the realm doesn't go over the top like it does in Jotunheim, for example. The creatures are much more submissive and less destructive. So on and so. I mean, it goes on. It goes on. The examples, but it just, for me, it has incredible interest attached to it, and that's why I've given a slightly longer video to Vanaheim than I have Asgard and Midgard, because there really is a lot more potentially to discuss about it, because one, there's less answers out there. The answers aren't in the texts, so it's left more to our imagination. But what is answered is incredibly intriguing in its own respect anyway. It was a land of Uttengard, but it acted like a land of Innengard. It was wild. Didn't have civilization as such, but it acted in such a way to progress those that were of the Innengard. That's what I'm trying to say. Anyway, that's my passion and my thoughts on Vanaheim and the Vanir themselves. And I really hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you can hear me because I'm losing my voice. As you've noticed, all my videos, I've been in bed recently, filming, because I've had the flu. I've not been too well, and even though I've made it down to the gym a couple of times, they were mistakes. I shouldn't have gone because it does make you ill again. But I hope you can hear me, and you heard me loud and clear throughout the whole video, because this is as loud as I can talk at the moment. But thanks for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed the video. I'm probably going to be talking about Alfheim next, or maybe Jotunheim. We'll see. But there is a realm coming up as soon as I can get the time to film a video on it. Cheers, guys. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you soon.